Good evening, and thank you for joining me for another Boring Books for Bedtime. I hope tonight's selection provides all the boredom your busy brain needs to quiet down and let you get some sleep. Before we begin, I'd like to give a special shout out of thanks to some new members of our Patreon family: Victoria, Dustin, and Annika. Thank you all so much for supporting this podcast. By becoming members of Patreon, you help us remain 100% listener supported and ad-free for everyone, and it's very much appreciated. If you're interested in supporting Boring Books for Bedtime and finding out more about the perks available to subscribers, including exclusive episodes heard nowhere else, you'll find a link to Patreon in the show description. You'll also find a link to buymeacoffee.com, where you can support us with a one-time tip, no subscription required. I hope you'll take a moment to check them out. Now, let's read and relax. Find a comfortable spot. Adjust your volume. Take a nice deep breath in. Let it out slowly. And off we go. Tonight, in honor of the season and in response to many requests for more, let's continue with the Book of Werewolves, being an account of terrible superstition by Sabine Baring-Gould. First published in 1865 by Smith, Elder & Co., London. Let's pick up right where we left off at the beginning of Chapter 4. Let's begin. Chapter 4: The Origin of the Scandinavian Werewolf. One of the great advantages of the study of Old Norse or Icelandic literature is the insight given by it into the origin of worldwide superstitions. Norse tradition is transparent as glacier ice, and its origin is as unmistakable. Medieval mythology, rich and gorgeous, is a compound like Corinthian brass, into which many pure ores have been fused, or it is a full, turbid river drawn from numerous feeders which had their sources in remote climes. It is a blending of primeval Celtic, Teutonic, Scandinavian, Italic, and Arab traditions, each adding a beauty, each yielding a charm, but each accretion rendering the analysis more difficult. Paciuchelli says, "The Anio flows into the Tiber. Pure as crystal it meets the tawny stream and is lost in it, so that there is no more Anio, but the united stream is all Tiber." So is it with each tributary to the tide of medieval mythology. The moment it has blended its waters with the great and onward rolling flood, it is impossible to detect it with certainty. It has swollen the stream, but has lost its own identity. If we would analyze a particular myth, we must not go at once to the body of medieval superstition, but strike at one of the tributaries before its absorption. This we shall proceed to do, and in selecting Norse mythology, we come upon abundant material pointing naturally to the spot whence it has been derived, as glacial moraines indicate the direction which they have taken and point to the mountains whence they have fallen. It will not be difficult for us to arrive at the origin of the northern belief in werewolves, and the data thus obtained will be useful in assisting us to elucidate much that would otherwise prove obscure in medieval tradition. Among the Old Norse, it was the custom for certain warriors to dress in the skins of the beasts they had slain, and thus to give themselves an air of ferocity, calculated to strike terror into the hearts of their foes. Such dresses are mentioned in some sagas, without there being any supernatural qualities attached to them. For instance, in the Njala, there is mention of a man i Gethioni in goatskin dress. Much in the same way do we hear of Harold Harfager having in his company a band of berserker who were all dressed in wolfskins, Ulfhethner, and this expression, wolfskin coated, is met with as a man's name. Thus in the Holmverja saga, there is mention of a Bjorn, son of Ulfhethen, wolfskin coat, son of Ulfhammer, wolf-shaped, son of Ulf, wolf, son of Ulfhammer, wolf-shaped, who could change forms. But the most conclusive passage is in the Vatsdala saga, and is as follows. Those berserker who were called Ulfhethner had got wolfskins over their male coats. In like manner, the word berserker, used of a man possessed of superhuman powers and subject to excesses of diabolical fury, was originally applied to one of those doughty champions who went about in bear sarks, or habits made of bearskin over their armor. I am well aware that Bjorn Haldersson's derivation of berserker, bare of sark, or destitute of clothing, has been hitherto generally received, but Svebjorn Egilson, an indisputable authority, rejects this derivation as untenable and substitutes for it that which I have adopted. It may be well imagined that a wolf or a bearskin would make a warm and comfortable greatcoat to a man whose manner of living required him to defy all weathers, and that the dress would not only give him an appearance of grimness and ferocity, likely to produce an unpleasant emotion in the breast of a foe, but also that the thick fur might prove effectual in deadening the blows rained on him in conflict. The berserker was an object of aversion and terror to the peaceful inhabitants of the land, his avocation being to challenge quiet country farmers to single combat. As the law of the land stood in Norway, a man who declined to accept a challenge forfeited all his possessions, even to the wife of his bosom, as a poltroon unworthy of the protection of the law, and every item of his property passed into the hands of his challenger. The berserker accordingly had the unhappy man at his mercy. If he slew him, the farmer's possessions became his, and if the poor fellow declined to fight, he lost all legal right to his inheritance. A berserker would invite himself to any feast and contribute his quota to the hilarity of the entertainment by snapping the backbone or cleaving the skull of some merrymaker who incurred his displeasure, or whom he might single out to murder for no other reason than a desire to keep his hand in practice. It may well be imagined that popular superstition went along with the popular dread of these wolf and bear-skinned rovers, and that they were believed to be endued with the force, as they certainly were with the ferocity, of the beasts whose skins they wore. Nor would superstition stop there, but the imagination of the trembling peasants would speedily invest these unscrupulous disturbers of the public peace with the attributes hitherto appropriated to trolls and Jotuns. The incident mentioned in the Volsung saga of the sleeping men being found with their wolf skins hanging to the wall above their heads is divested of its improbability if we regard those skins as worn over their armor, and the marvelous in the whole story is reduced to a minimum when we suppose that Sigmund and Sinfjotli stole these for the purpose of disguising themselves whilst they lived a life of violence and robbery. In a similar manner, the story of the northern Beauty and Beast in Hrolf's Saga Kraka is rendered less improbable on the supposition that Bjorn was living as an outlaw among the mountain fastnesses in a bearskin dress, which would effectually disguise him, all but his eyes, which would gleam out of the sockets in his hideous visor, unmistakably human. His very name, Bjorn, signifies a bear, and these two circumstances may well have invested a kernel of historic fact with all the romance of fable, and if divested of these supernatural embellishments, the story would resolve itself into the very simple fact of there having been a King Hring of the Updales who was at variance with his son, and whose son took to the woods and lived a berserker life in company with his mistress till he was captured and slain by his father. I think that the circumstance insisted on by the saga writers of the eyes of the person remaining unchanged is very significant, and points to the fact that the skin was merely drawn over the body as a disguise. But there was other ground for superstition to fasten on the berserker and invest them with supernatural attributes. No fact in connection with the history of the Northmen is more firmly established on reliable evidence than that of the berserker rage being a species of diabolical possession. The berserker were said to work themselves up into a state of frenzy, in which a demoniacal power came over them, impelling them to acts from which, in their sober senses, they would have recoiled. They acquired superhuman force, and were as invulnerable and as insensible to pain as the Jansenist convulsionists of Saint Medard. No sword would wound them, no fire could burn them. A club alone could destroy them by breaking their bones or crushing in their skulls. Their eyes glared as though a flame burned in the sockets. They ground their teeth and frothed at the mouth. They gnawed at their shield rims, and are said to have sometimes bitten them through. And as they rushed into conflict, they yelped as dogs or howled as wolves. According to the unanimous testimony of the Old Norse historians, the berserker rage was extinguished by baptism, and as Christianity advanced, the number of these berserker decreased. But it must not be supposed that this madness or possession came only on those persons who predisposed themselves to be attacked by it. Others were afflicted with it, who vainly struggled against its influence, and who deeply lamented their own liability to be seized with these terrible excesses of frenzy. Such was Thorir Ingemund's, of whom it is said in the Vatsdala saga that at times there came over Thorir berserker fits, and it was considered a sad misfortune to such a man, as they were quite beyond control. The manner in which he was cured is remarkable, pointing as it does to the craving in the heathen mind for a better and more merciful creed. Thorgrim of Kornsa had a child by his concubine Vereidr, and by order of his wife, the child was carried out to perish. The brothers Thorstein and Thorir often met, and it was now the turn of Thorstein to visit Thorir, and Thorir accompanied him homeward. On their way, Thorstein asked Thorir which he thought was the first among the brethren. Thorir answered that the reply was easy, for you are above us all in discretion and talent. Jokul is the best in all perilous adventures, but I, he added, I am the least worth of us brothers, because the berserker fits come over me quite against my will, and I wish that you, my brother, with your shrewdness, would devise some help for me. Thorstein said, I have heard that our kinsman Thorgrim has just suffered his little babe to be carried out at the instigation of his wife. That is ill done. I think also that it is a grievous matter for you to be different in nature from other men. Thorir asked how he could obtain release from his affliction. Then said Thorstein, Now will I make a vow to him who created the sun, for I ween that he is most able to take the ban of you, and I will undertake for his sake in return to rescue the babe and to bring it up for him, till he who created man shall take it to himself, for this I reckon he will do. After this, they left their horses and sought the child, and a thrall of Thorir had found it near the Maram River. They saw that a kerchief had been spread over its face, but it had rumpled it up over its nose. The little thing was all but dead, but they took it up and flitted it home to Thorir's house, and he brought the lad up and called him Thorkel Rumpel. As for the berserker fits, they came on him no more. But the most remarkable passages bearing on our subject will be found in the Egla. There was a man, Ulf the Wolf by name, son of Bjolfi and Halbera. Ulf was a man so tall and strong that the like of him was not to be seen in the land at that time, and when he was young he went out on Viking expeditions and harrying. He was a great landed proprietor. It was his wont to rise early and to go about the men's work or to the smithies and inspect all his goods and his acres, and sometimes he talked with those men who wanted his advice, for he was a good adviser, he was so clear-headed. However, every day, when it drew towards dusk, he became so savage that few dared exchange a word with him, for he was given to dozing in the afternoon. People said that he was much given to changing form, or hamrammer, so he was called the evening wolf, Kveldulfr. In this and the following passages, I do not consider hamrammer to have its primary signification of actual transformation, but simply to mean subject to fits of diabolical possession, under the influence of which the bodily powers were greatly exaggerated. I shall translate pretty freely from this most interesting saga, as I consider that the description given in it of Kveldulf in his fits greatly elucidates our subject. Kveldulf and Skallagrim got news during summer of an expedition. Skallagrim was the keenest-sighted of men, and he caught sight of the vessel of Halvard and his brother, and recognized it at once. He followed their course and marked the haven into which they entered at evening. Then he returned to his company and told Kveldulf of what he had seen. Then they busked him and got ready both their boats. In each they put 20 men, Kveldulf steering one and Skallagrim the other, and they rowed in quest of the ship. Now when they came to the place where it was, they lay to. Hallvard and his men had spread an awning over the deck and were asleep. Now when Kveldulf and his party came upon them, the watchers who were seated at the end of the bridge sprang up and called to the people on board to wake up, for there was danger in the wind. So Hallvard and his men sprang to arms. Then came Kveldulf over the bridge, and Skallagrim with him into the ship. Kveldulf had in his hand a cleaver, and he bade his men go through the vessel and hack away the awning. But he pressed on to the quarterdeck. It is said the werewolf fit came over him and many of his companions. They slew all the men who were before them. Skallagrim did the same as he went round the vessel. He and his father paused not till they had cleared it. Now when Kveldulf came upon the quarterdeck, he raised his cleaver, and smote Hallvard through helm and head, so that the haft was buried in the flesh, but he dragged it to him so violently that he whisked Hallvard into the air and flung him overboard. Skallagrim cleared the forecastle and slew Sigtrygg. Many men flung themselves overboard, but Skallagrim's men took to the boat and rowed about, killing all they found. Thus perished Hallvard with 50 men. Skallagrim and his party took the ship and all the goods which had belonged to Hallvard, and flitted it and the wares to their own vessel, and then exchanged ships, lading their capture but quitting their own, after which they filled their old ship with stones, broke it up and sank it. A good breeze sprang up, and they stood out to sea. It is said of these men in the engagement who were werewolves, or those upon whom came the berserker rage, that as long as the fit was on them, no one could oppose them, they were so strong. But when it had passed off, they were feebler than usual. It was the same with Kveldulf when the werewolf fit went off him. He then felt the exhaustion consequent on the fight, and he was so completely done up that he was obliged to take to his bed. In like manner, Skallagrim had his fits of frenzy, taking after his amiable father. Thord and his companion were opposed to Skallagrim in the game, and they were too much for him. He wearied, and the game went better with them. But at dusk after sunset, it went worse with Egil and Thord, for Skallagrim became so strong that he caught up Thord and cast him down, so that he broke his bones, and that was the death of him. Then he caught up Egil. Thorgerd Brock was the name of a servant of Skallagrim, who had been foster mother to Egil. She was a woman of great stature, strong as a man, and a bit of a witch. Brock exclaimed, "Skallagrim, are you now falling upon your son?" Then Skallagrim let go his hold of Egil and clutched at her. She started aside and fled. Skallagrim followed. They ran out upon Digraness, and she sprang off the headland into the water. Skallagrim cast after her a huge stone, which struck her between the shoulders, and she never rose after it. The place is now called Brock's Sound. Let it be observed that in these passages from the Egla, the words Athhamas, Hamrammer, etc., are used without any intention of conveying the idea of a change of bodily shape. though the words taken literally assert it, for they are derived from hammer, a skin or habit, a word which has its representatives in other Aryan languages, and is therefore a primitive word expressive of the skin of a beast. The Sanskrit karma, the Hindustan kam, hide or skin, and kamra, leather, the Persian game, clothing, disguise, the Gothic ham or hams, skin, and even the Italian camicia and the French chemise are cognate words. It seems probable accordingly that the verb athamas was first applied to those who wore the skins of savage animals and went about the country as freebooters, but that popular superstition soon invested them with supernatural powers, and they were supposed to assume the forms of the beasts in whose skins they were disguised. The verb then acquired the significance to become a werewolf, to change shape. It did not stop there, but went through another change of meaning, and was finally applied to those who were afflicted with paroxysms of madness or demoniacal possession. This was not the only word connected with werewolves which helped on the superstition. The word vargur, a wolf, had a double significance, which would be the means of originating many a werewolf story. Vargur is the same as uargur, restless, argur being the same as the Anglo-Saxon irg. Vargur had its double signification in Norse. It signified a wolf and also a godless man. This vargur is the English were in the word werewolf, and the guru or varu in French. The Danish word for werewolf is varulf, the Gothic vira-ulf. In the Roman de Guérin, it is Neu waru sanglante beste. In the Vie de Saint Hildefonds by Gautier de Concy, sin loup d'Esve, sin loup garol, ce sont diables que Saoul ne pouvait estre de nos mordre. Here the loup-garou is a devil. The Anglo-Saxons regarded him as an evil man, verg, a scoundrel, Gothic, varus, a fiend, but very often the word meant no more than an outlaw. Pluquet, in his Conte Populaire, tells us that the ancient Norman law said of the criminals condemned to outlawry for certain offenses, vargus esto, be an outlaw. In like manner, the lex ripuaria, vargus sit, hoe est expulsus. In the laws of Canute, he is called werewolf, and the Salic law orders, si quis corpus jam sepultum effoderet, aut expoliavaret vargus sit. If anyone shall have dug up or despoiled an already buried corpse, let him be a varg. Sidonius Apollinaris says, unam feminam quam forte vargorum, hoc enum nomine indegenis latrunculus nuncupant, as though the common name by which those who lived a freebooter life was designated, varg. In like manner, Palgrave assures us in his Rise and Progress of the English Commonwealth that among the Anglo-Saxons an outlaw, or outlaw, was said to have the head of a wolf. If then the term vargur was applied at one time to a wolf, at another to an outlaw who lived the life of a wild beast, away from the haunts of men, he shall be driven away as a wolf, and chased so far as men chase wolves farthest. It is certainly no matter of wonder that stories of outlaws should have become surrounded with mythical accounts of their transformation into wolves. But the very idiom of the Norse was calculated to foster this superstition. The Icelanders had curious expressions which are sufficiently likely to have produced misconceptions. Snorri not only relates that Odin changed himself into another form, but he adds that by his spells he turned his enemies into boars. In precisely the same manner does a hag, Lot, in the Vatsdala saga, say that she could have turned Thorstein and Jokul into boars to run about with the wild beasts, and the expression vertha al gjalti, or at joltum, to become a boar, is frequently met with in the sagas. Thereupon came Thorarin and his men upon them, and Nagli led the way. But when he saw weapons drawn, he was frightened, and ran away up the mountain and became a boar. And Thorarin and his men took to run, so as to help Nagli, lest he should tumble off the cliffs into the sea. A similar expression occurs in the Gisla saga Sursonar. In the Hrolfs saga Kraka, we meet with a troll in boar's shape, to whom divine honors are paid, and in the Kjalnesinga saga, men are likened to boars. Then it began to fare with them, as it fares with boars when they fight each other, for in the same manner dropped their foam. The true signification of Vertha at Yalti is to be in such a state of fear as to lose the senses, but it is sufficiently peculiar to have given rise to superstitious stories. I have dwelt at some length on the northern myths relative to werewolves and animal transformations, because I have considered the investigation of these all important towards the elucidation of the truth which lies at the bottom of medieval superstition, and which is nowhere so obtainable as through the Norse literature. As may be seen from the passages quoted above at length, and from an examination of those merely referred to, the result arrived at is pretty conclusive, and may be summed up in very few words. The whole superstructure of fable and romance relative to transformation into wild beasts reposes simply on this basis of truth, that among the Scandinavian nations there existed a form of madness or possession, under the influence of which men acted as though they were changed into wild and savage brutes, howling, foaming at the mouth, ravening for blood and slaughter, ready to commit any act of atrocity, and as irresponsible for their actions as the wolves and bears in whose skins they often equipped themselves. The manner in which this fact became invested with supernatural adjuncts I have also pointed out, to wit, the change in the significance of the word designating the madness, the double meaning of the word vargur, and above all, the habits and appearance of the maniacs. We shall see instances of berserker rage reappearing in the Middle Ages and late down into our own times, not exclusively in the north, but throughout France, Germany, and England. And instead of rejecting the accounts given by chroniclers as fabulous, because there is much connected with them which seems to be fabulous, we shall be able to refer them to their true origin. It may be accepted as an axiom that no superstition of general acceptance is destitute of a foundation of truth, and if we discover the myth of the werewolf to be widely spread, not only throughout Europe, but through the whole world, we may rest assured that there is a solid core of fact round which popular superstition has crystallized, and that fact is the existence of a species of madness during the excesses of which the person afflicted believes himself to be a wild beast and acts like a wild beast. In some cases, this madness amounts apparently to positive possession, and the diabolical acts into which the possessed is impelled are so horrible that the blood curdles in reading them, and it is impossible to recall them without a shudder. Chapter 5. The Werewolf in the Middle Ages. Olaus Magnus relates that, in Prussia, Livonia, and Lithuania, although the inhabitants suffer considerably from the rapacity of wolves throughout the year, and that these animals rend their cattle, which are scattered in great numbers through the woods, whenever they stray in the very least, yet this is not regarded by them as such a serious matter as what they endure from men turned into wolves. On the feast of the Nativity of Christ at night, such a multitude of wolves transformed from men gather together in a certain spot, arranged among themselves, and then spread to rage with wondrous ferocity against human beings, and those animals which are not wild, that the natives of these regions suffer more detriment from these than they do from true and natural wolves. For when a human habitation has been detected by them, isolated in the woods, they besiege it with atrocity, striving to break in the doors, and in the event of their doing so, they devour all the human beings and every animal which is found within. They burst into the beer cellars, and there they empty the tuns of beer or mead, and pile up the empty casks one above another in the middle of the cellar, thus showing their difference from natural and genuine wolves. Between Lithuania, Livonia, and Courland are the walls of a certain old ruined castle. At this spot congregate thousands on a fixed occasion and try their agility in jumping. Those who are unable to bound over the wall, as is often the case with the fattest, are fallen upon with scourges by the captains and slain. Olaus relates also in the story of a certain nobleman who was traveling through a large forest with some peasants in his retinue who dabbled in the black art. They found no house where they could lodge for the night and were well nigh famished. Then one of the peasants offered, if all the rest would hold their tongues as to what he should do, that he would bring them a lamb from a distant flock. He thereupon retired into the depths of the forest and changed his form into that of a wolf, fell upon the flock, and brought a lamb to his companions in his mouth. They received it with gratitude. Then he retired once more into the thicket and transformed himself back again into his human shape. The wife of a nobleman in Livonia expressed her doubts to one of her slaves whether it was possible for man or woman thus to change shape. The servant at once volunteered to give her evidence of the possibility. He left the room, and in another moment a wolf was observed running over the country. The dogs followed him, and notwithstanding his resistance, tore out one of his eyes. Next day, the slave appeared before his mistress, blind of an eye. Bishop Majolus and Caspar Pucer relate the following circumstances of the Livonians. At Christmas, a boy lame of a leg goes round the country summoning the devil's followers, who are countless, to a general conclave. Whoever remains behind or goes reluctantly is scourged by another with an iron whip till the blood flows, and his traces are left in blood. The human form vanishes, and the whole multitude become wolves. Many thousands assemble. Foremost goes the leader armed with an iron whip, and the troop follow, firmly convinced in their imaginations that they are transformed into wolves. They fall upon herds of cattle and flocks of sheep, but they have no power to slay men. When they come to a river, the leader smites the water with his scourge, and it divides, leaving a dry path through the midst by which the pack may go. The transformation lasts during 12 days, at the expiration of which period the wolf skin vanishes and the human form reappears. This superstition was expressly forbidden by the Church. In like manner did Saint Boniface preach against those who believed superstitiously in the strigus et fictos lupos. In a dissertation by Müller, we learn on the authority of Cluverius and Danavarius that a certain Albertus Paracovsius in Muscovy was wont to tyrannize over and harass his subjects in the most unscrupulous manner. One night when he was absent from home, his whole herd of cattle, acquired by extortion, perished. On his return he was informed of his loss, and the wicked man broke out into the most horrible blasphemies, exclaiming, "Let him who has slain eat. If God chooses, let him devour me as well." As he spoke, drops of blood fell to earth, and the nobleman, transformed into a wild dog, rushed upon his dead cattle, tore and mangled the carcasses, and began to devour them. Possibly he may be devouring them still. His wife, then near her confinement, died of fear. Of these circumstances, there were not only ear but also eye witnesses. Similarly, it is related of a nobleman in the neighborhood of Prague that he robbed his subjects of their goods and reduced them to penury through his exactions. He took the last cow from a poor widow with 5 children, but as a judgment, all his own cattle died. He then broke into fearful oaths, and God transformed him into a dog. His human head, however, remained. Saint Patrick is said to have changed Vereticus, King of Wales, into a wolf, and Saint Natalis the Abbot to have pronounced anathema upon an illustrious family in Ireland, in consequence of which every male and female take the form of wolves for 7 years, and live in the forests and career over the bogs, howling mournfully, and appeasing their hunger upon the sheep of the peasants. A Duke of Prussia, according to Majolus, had a countryman brought for sentence before him, because he had devoured his neighbor's cattle. The fellow was an ill-favored, deformed man, with great wounds in his face, which he had received from dogs' bites whilst he had been in his wolf's form. It was believed that he changed shape twice in the year, at Christmas and at midsummer. He was said to exhibit much uneasiness and discomfort, when the wolf hair began to break out and his bodily shape to change. He was kept long in prison and closely watched, lest he should become a werewolf during his confinement and attempt to escape, but nothing remarkable took place. If this is the same individual as that mentioned by Olaus Magnus, as there seems to be a probability, the poor fellow was burned alive. John of Nuremberg relates the following curious story. A priest was once traveling in a strange country and lost his way in a forest. Seeing a fire, he made towards it and beheld a wolf seated over it. The wolf addressed him in human voice and bade him not fear, as he was of the Osirian race, of which a man and a woman were doomed to spend a certain number of years in wolf's form. Only after 7 years might they return home and resume their former shapes if they were still alive. He begged the priest to visit and console his sick wife and to give her the last sacraments. This the priest consented to do after some hesitation, and only when convinced of the beasts being human beings, by observing that the wolf used his front paws as hands, and when he saw the she-wolf peel off her wolf skin from her head to her navel, exhibiting the features of an aged woman. There is an interesting paper by Linnaeus on the Courland werewolves in the Breslauer Sammlung. The author says, there are too many examples derived not merely from hearsay, but received on indisputable evidence, for us to dispute the fact that Satan, if we do not deny that such a being exists, and that he has his work in the children of darkness, holds the lycanthropus in his net in 3 ways. 1. They execute as wolves certain acts, such as seizing a sheep or destroying cattle, etc., not changed into wolves, which no scientific man in Courland believes, but in their human frames and with their human limbs, yet in such a state of fantasy and hallucination that they believe themselves transformed into wolves, and are regarded as such by others, suffering under similar hallucination, and in this manner run these people in packs as wolves, though not true wolves. 2. They imagine in deep sleep or dream that they injure the cattle, and this without leaving their couch, but it is their master who does in their stead what their fancy points out or suggests to him. 3. The evil one drives natural wolves to do some act, and then pictures it so well to the sleeper, immovable in his place, both in dreams and at waking, that he believes the act to have been committed by himself. Linnaeus, under these heads, relates 3 stories which he believes he has on good authority. The first is of a gentleman starting on a journey, who came upon a wolf engaged in the act of seizing a sheep in his own flock. He fired at it and wounded it, so that it fled howling to the thicket. When the gentleman returned from his expedition, he found the whole neighborhood impressed with the belief that he had, on a given day and hour, shot at one of his tenants, a publican Mickle. On inquiry, the man's wife, called Leba, related the following circumstances, which were fully corroborated by numerous witnesses. When the husband had sown his rye, he had consulted with his wife how he was to get some meat so as to have a good feast. The woman urged him on no account to steal from his landlord's flock, because it was guarded by fierce dogs. He, however, rejected her advice, and Mickle fell upon his landlord's sheep but he had suffered and had come limping home, and in his rage at the ill success of his attempt, had fallen upon his own horse and had bitten its throat completely through. This took place in the year 1684. In 1684, a man was about to fire upon a pack of wolves when he heard from among the troop a voice exclaiming, "Gossip, gossip, don't fire. No good will come of it." The third story is as follows. A lycanthropist was brought before a judge and accused of witchcraft, but as nothing could be proved against him, the judge ordered one of his peasants to visit the man in his prison and to worm the truth out of him, and to persuade the prisoner to assist him in revenging himself upon another peasant who had injured him, and this was to be effected by destroying one of the man's cows. But the peasant was to urge the prisoner to do it secretly, and if possible in the disguise of a wolf. The fellow undertook the task, but he had great difficulty in persuading the prisoner to fall in with his wishes. Eventually, however, he succeeded. Next morning the cow was found in its stall frightfully mangled, but the prisoner had not left his cell, for the watch, who had been placed to observe him, declared that he had spent the night in profound sleep, and that he had only at one time made a slight motion with his head and hands and feet. Virius and Forestus quote Gulielmius Brabantinus as an authority for the fact that a man of high position had been so possessed by the evil one that often during the year he fell into a condition in which he believed himself to be turned into a wolf, and at that time he roved in the woods and tried to seize and devour little children, but that at last, by God's mercy, he recovered his senses. And with those tales of werewolves from the Middle Ages, which I'm sure were all completely true, I think we'll end this evening's reading from the Book of Werewolves. I do enjoy our author's rather skeptical view of these stories, and I hope you enjoyed that as well. If you'd like to read this curious volume for yourself, as always, you'll find a link to a free ebook from Project Gutenberg in the show description. If you'd like to connect, suggest a boring book you'd like to hear read, or request more from one we've already started, you can drop me an email via our website, www.boringbookspod.com. It's always a pleasure to hear from you. Thank you so much for joining me for this evening's reading. Until our next boring book, good night.